core membership which was happy to move into Heriot Row and take up the new premises. It attracted the first secretary was a Mrs. Mowat, who was also secretary to Mrs. Miller. The opening of the college was presided over by the British socialist and journalist Helen Swaffer. It was chaired by Helen Swaffer. The Reverend Drayton Thomas gave the religious opening, the religious blessing, and John Brown Mackinder, who was president of the union, I think 32 to 39, was also there in attendance. So we had three of the alumni of the spiritualist movement on the opening night. Three presidents of the union became trustees of the college over the next 25 to 30 odd years. Forget his first name, a man called Haig and Harold Viggers. And Ernest Oughton was a third one. More of Ernest Oughton later. The college also had, on average, at least through the 30s and the 40s, an average of 240 members. So it was quite a big affair. Mrs. Miller included the name library in the title. It was the Edinburgh College, Psychic College and Library, because she wanted the students of the college to have access to the best possible library. And I spent many a happy long hour in that library myself, and it has over 3,000 books. Pardon me. It also had a bound edition of the first year of Psychic News. I hope it's still there. The college attracted all the big names of spiritualism. It was virtually cannot think of anyone who didn't attend the college in some capacity or other. And they have kept and preserved a book there where they signed in, and if you were somebody in the movement, sure enough, you would sign your signature in the minute book there. I'll show you a photograph. Between 1932 and 1966, one of the most popular speakers of the day was this lady, Helen Hughes. Can you quite see that? Quite a short, sprightly lady. Helen Hughes came from Sunderland, CM Colliery in Sunderland, and she attended the college over 30 years. She died in 1967. Also, Maurice Barbanel became a good friend of the college and visited regularly, as did Harry Edwards. And those three and others gave large meetings around Edinburgh. If you know Edinburgh, the Usher Hall near the Caledonian Hotel at the end of Princes Street, which would could seat 3,000 people, and Helen Hughes, Maurice Barbanel would give public meetings there. They were called propaganda meetings. Helen Swaffer or Maurice Barbanel, whoever, Ernest Oughton, would give a speech, a talk, a propaganda meeting, as they called it, and then Helen Hughes or Edith Potts, Ena Twig, would give a demonstration of clairvoyance. From the 40s and during the 40s and 50s, Harry Edwards became a frequent visitor to the college. And of course, Heriot Row, smack in the middle of Georgian Edinburgh, the visitors could be housed there and given good accommodation. There were lots of reports of the miracle cures given by Harry Edwards in public at places like the Usher Hall. And of course, they were big money spinners. They were terrific money spinners, and they were an important source of bringing in new people to the college itself. The autograph book that I referred to is missing an autograph. Now, between 1932, the opening of the college, and 1950, one of the frequent visitors to the college was Helen Duncan. But for some reason, she was never actually asked to sign in as a visiting dignitary. Helen Duncan, you may know, Helen Duncan was arrested in 1933. And funnily enough, where the college is now in Melville Street, round the corner, you have Stafford Street. And in 1932, she'd given a public seance there And the police had arrested her at the end of that seance, and she stood trial in the magistrate's court, was charged 10 shillings for fraud. In law, the post-mortem do not exist. Therefore, anyone who says that they do and that they can materialize the departed is a fraud. Ergo, 10 bob fine. Thank you. Helen Duncan, there was a story. It's one of those apocryphal tales you can never quite prove. Helen Duncan was said to be, thought the college was a bit hoity-toity. She thought it was a bit snobbish. Whatever the truth of that was, there was also a further story that she only went there a few times, but that's not true. She actually served it for getting on for 18 years and quite frequently. She is listed in our wonderful manual and who's who of British spiritualism, and her address is given as Waltrip Place in Cragmilla. So she was a local woman living in Edinburgh at that time. I'll come back to Helen Duncan. It was remarkable that in the 1930s, not so nowadays, that the range of phenomena that somebody walking in off the street could experience was extraordinary. A forgotten name now was Mrs. McCallum. Mrs. McCallum was an independent direct voice medium of Glasgow. Also well known was John Sloan. Now, he didn't come to the college, but one of the women who sat at the college regularly did actually go and see him, and she left accounts. Mrs. Coolmore Seymour left accounts of her visits to him. In the mid-1930s, a woman called Catherine Allen became honorary principal. They were always known as honorary principals for some reason. They were known as honorary principals, and she was a principal up to her resignation in 1960, when she was already well into her late 80s. Catherine Allen had lost her son in a motorbike accident, and as many do, they'd found comfort in spiritualism and had attended direct voice sittings and materialization seance with Helen Duncan at the college. And gradually, she and Mrs. Miller became friends, and eventually in the mid-1930s, she took over as principal. And she was widely regarded, she was quite a capable executive woman, and she was very warm, very welcoming, and she has a very good reputation still. I just remembered, in fact, when Robert Miller married Ethel Miller, the Victoria and Albert in London preserves their wedding photograph, and it's a photograph of Ethel Maud Miller in this glorious Edwardian dressing gown with a huge long trail which sort of sweeps in front of you. And if you look on the side for the Victoria and Albert, you can actually see Ethel Maud Miller in her wedding gown. It's a beauty. I didn't actually get that photograph till after the book had been published. So what are we going to say next? The speakers and demonstrators were the life of the college. And of course, the college approached World War II. And as we got into the war period, the college activities expanded greatly. When we were doing research, the principal of the college, Magnus McInnes, who was a dear friend of ours, he passed away in 2013. What happened is the college moved in 1972 to Melville Place in Queensferry, just south of Princess Street. And it's an apartment. Now, you don't think of the Georgians building apartments, but they did. A lovely, lovely tall room, wonderful ceilings, and there are staff quarters, and it's this oddest little space. It's got a ship's ladder to get up into them. And once upon a time, the resident staff would sleep in these little rooms, and the college. Oh, Margaret, can you still hear me? Margaret.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I've lost the picture. I'll continue talking if you like. I don't know what's going wrong.
I don't know. Someone was joining it, I think.
Okay. I'll just come out of it.
Yeah.
Back to meeting. Well, what happened? Oops, on the Facebook page now.
I know. I don't...
Back to meeting. You can hear me, can you?
Few options. Yeah, I don't know why. It's
Well, I'll continue talking. I'm sorry, we've seemed. Oh, well, here we are.
Yeah.
Well, one day, me and Magnus would go up in the archives are a mess. Oh my God, boxes and boxes of papers. You know, researcher's nightmare. And me and Magnus went upstairs, and we found in one of the boxes a pile of shellac records. You know, those 78 pre-war stuff, and. Three of them were anonymous. They were produced by the Regent's Parlophone Company or something like that in London. And there was 3, 4, and 5. So 1 and 2 were missing. They were completely anonymous. God knows what they were. But the other ones were of Ernest Oaten giving the first discussion, the first broadcast about spiritualism on the radio in April of 1934. And I'm going to play one of the recordings a bit later. He has this beautiful, well-modulated voice, and I'll play you some of it later. And we also found an EP, remember EPs if you're of my age, EP of Harry Edwards talking about healing. So we have 3 treasures here, but 3 of the records, they are in sequence, 3, 4, 5, A and B, are anonymous. So we came back, this is in 2006. So we had friends who had a 78 player. So have you ever had a Tutankhamun moment in your life? You remember Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun and said, wonderful things. And that day we put on the number 3, because we haven't got 1 and 2, remember? And this is what came out.
Albert, dear. Yes. Yes, you're going to, there's a gentleman here who's wondering if he might think the record. And he'll speak for himself.
Albert, I want to tell you what I'm doing. This is a gramophone recording machine, and I want to record your voice because so many people want to hear it. Do you mind?
I don't mind the music. If I don't feel ready,
Thank you, Albert.
I don't mind about the metal. I don't mind the metal. Right.
Thank
As
you.
long as I know to protect Mrs. Duncan against any completing of a stuff. I thought come and say how to do to everybody. I do see some faces I know. Yes. Hi, Mrs. Miller. Yes. Mrs. Allen. I'm in a different place today. I see. It's rock. I'm going to ask Mrs. Johnson to stand up now, and I'd like you to tell me if you can see her. Please.
Yes, this is going to stand up. And if you could quite catch that, Albert Stewart, the materialized guide to Helen Duncan. This, ladies and gentlemen, if there are any gentlemen watching, is a bust of Albert Stewart. There's a story behind that too. Albert Stewart says, "Am I not the most important person here?" A sense of modesty here. But to put that record on, and of course these have been digitally remastered several times and cleaned up, you know, to put that shellac record on and hear a voice that hasn't been heard in 72 years was an extraordinary moment. Here is one of the voices and one of the most famous spirit guides in the spiritualist movement, Albert Stewart, and he speaks. And of course, that when he asks, I'm going to ask Mrs. Duncan to stand up now. Mrs. Duncan, of course, is completely in trance. And it was a ritual that they performed at every seance where the materialized form stood next to the cabinet, and Albert asked Mrs. Duncan to stand up so that in deep, good red light, ruby light as they say in America, the form and the medium could be seen together, standing next to one another. Isn't that marvelous, really? How wonderful. And Mrs. Culmore Seymour, that I referred to, sat some 12 times with Helen Duncan at the Edinburgh College, Psychic College and Library. And she subsequently wrote a book called Marjorie. Marjorie was her daughter. Laura Culmore Seymour was married to a commander in the Royal Navy who was based at Rosyth, just north of Edinburgh. And their daughter, the lovely Marjorie, had died off Largs in Lanarkshire, off the coast of Ayrshire in 1934. And the mother, Laura Culmore Seymour, sat subsequently with John Sloan, Mrs. McCallum, and with Helen Duncan, and wrote a book about her experiences with these different mediums, which is preserved in the library. And of course, the library, it also gives a wonderful account of the library. It's one of the few written documents about the library from a contemporary who knew the college at that time. So it's quite remarkable. Well, like any good researcher, you would like to date the recordings. Now, where do you start? I mean, this is having got them cleaned up, audible, because whilst Albert had a very strong voice, they weren't necessarily, you could hardly hear most of it. But I know that Mrs. Seymour was absent for a few of the years of the 1930s, but she came back in 37 and she was there through to 1939. So we had that little snapshot. We know that she retired in 39. We know she died in 1946. So we get a snapshot period 37 to 39. And then when we had the recordings cleaned up, one of Helen Duncan's famous visitors, materialization, was a child guide called Peggy. And listening to these recordings one day, I heard Peggy saying, "It's my birthday on Tuesday." Then a little later in the recording, we can hear, "Oh, I was born on the 14th of December." So actually, once I caught that, and it was terribly hard to hear these recordings for most of the time that I had them, we can pinpoint that actually this recording was made in the week prior to that Tuesday, the 14th December 1937. Isn't that fantastic? Eh? And I subsequently was told, we had proof that Dr. Carl Wickland had been at that seance. It's not apparent to me, but we know that he'd signed in to the college visitors book. So he was there, and he was almost certainly at that recording. So I was subsequently able to date the recording, which was wonderful. This, of course, is Helen Duncan. I'm sure you've all seen her photograph many times. She died in 1956. And in 1956, as you know, there was a police raid in Nottinghamshire. The recordings that I've just played, where's one of the tapes? These are the CD that I produced. It says on that, this is the only recording of a Helen Duncan seance. It's a shellac recording, so it's pre-war. The engineer said to me they're rarer than hen's teeth, pre-war private recordings. But I now know that there is a second recording of Helen Duncan's seance. I have to be careful about what I say because it is still in copyright, and it said that it's recorded on reel-to-reel tape. reel-to-reel tape was a German innovation of the 1940s and didn't become available till after 1945 in this country. And it's said that the recordings have Midland voices on them, in specifically Nottingham and Derbyshire, which is where, of course, Helen Duncan final seance was given in Nottinghamshire in 1956, the year of her death, when the police broke in. So almost certainly we can say that those recordings were recorded in the North Midlands in the 1950s. But that those recordings haven't been released. And it's a great pity, really, isn't it? What a treasure for the spiritualist movement to have a second audio recording of a Helen Duncan seance. My recording, the one that I have on the CD, is about 25 minutes long. But as I was saying earlier, Ernest Oughton, another president of the union, had also made a broadcast and a recording in 1934. Excuse me. I'm going to play that next. This is a beautiful voice. This is a BBC recorded broadcast.
I have been asked as a representative spiritualist to tell you what I believe. A man's convictions are based upon his training plus his experience. I was brought up in the bosom of nonconformity, and in my late teens was seriously troubled by grave doubts concerning matters of religion. It seemed to me that the whole of religion turned upon the question of whether there is or is not an afterlife. If there is no life beyond this, then there may be a case for ethics and morality, but there is none for religion. And accordingly, the existence of a spiritual world forms the preamble of all the great religions.
There are a number of recordings, copies of that recording, one of which Paul Gaunt has at the Arthur Findlay College. He's the archivist and historian down there. The college, after the end of when it comes round to the 1960s, the college, which was a massive building on maybe how many, 4, 6, 8 floors, had become a bit of a white elephant. The building itself was thought to have subsidence. They sold off the Muse House at the back, at the bottom of the garden, which I mentioned, and the college, the building itself had become very expensive to maintain. And the college was operating on 2 floors. So the bulk of the building was unoccupied. Well, back in 2007, a flat in Georgian Newtown was going for $3,500 a month. That was in 2007. And of course, an entire building would be worth many millions. The option to turn Heriot Row into a block of flats was looked at by the then council of the college. And as Magnus said to me, it was thought to be impractical, that there was no real market. This is in the late 60s, early 70s, that there was no real market for flats in Edinburgh at that time. The cost of renovations to the property were considerable. The old guard had died off. Mrs. Allen died in 1966. Helen Hughes had died 1967. But they still had a very valuable asset, and it was a very painful decision that the council of the college had to make to move. They found a property in Melville Street, and they left in December of 1972, and not till the late spring of 1973 did they move into Melville Street, which is where the college is based today. It changed its name at that time. In fact, it changed its name in 1975 to the College of Parapsychology, which was sort of fashionable at that time, I guess. And now, in fact, they've changed their name back to the College of Psychic Studies. The college itself flourished. It kind of released, they gave it sufficient capital to pay off its debts and its to underwrite its running costs. And in 1996, I think it was, or 95, Magnus McInnes became principal of the college, with his wife Angela McInnes, who's a good friend of ours, OSNU. They took the college forward, and it flourished again, and is still thriving today. I think that's the end of our talk. So we saw that from 1932, Mrs. Miller was terribly well connected. She financed this college out of her own pocket. She in fact paid the salaries for the staff, Mrs. Kathleen Allen, Mrs. Mowat, and all the others, from her own funds for many years until her death. And it attracted all the great names of contemporary spiritualism to work for it, including Helen Duncan and the other physical mediums. But they gave huge public meetings in the great halls around Edinburgh. And of the 16 or so colleges in 1932, I think there's about 3, 4 left, still flourishing. Anyway, the Edinburgh College of Parapsychology is in Melville Street if you'd like to visit it. I have the CD here, if anybody would like one. It's at £10 including postage. Before we finish, I thought it would be nice to hear Albert Stewart once again. And of course, we now know this was from December 1937, when he closed in the seance of that day in prayer. And this is Albert Stewart's voice closing in prayer.
Sacred Spirit of all, that we may thank Him for all the blessings He has given to us. Help us to be kind and considerate in our everyday walk of life. Banish all jealousy from our nature, and to refrain from judging others, lest we also be judged. I want to say my own few words to you before I go. You still hear me talking to you. I would like to say now to each and every one here, God be with you till we meet again.
We took the meet again. Peggy often sang that song in her seances. In fact, in the seance recording, she sings, "Oh, sweet mystery of life, at last I found you," which is really rather appropriate. Next week, we're going to look at the differences between the American spiritualist movement and the British spiritualist movement, and we show how that they've diverged